Hello and welcome to Worldview from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where each Friday we bring together a panel of distinguished journalists from around the world to discuss the major global issues of the week. I'm Brian Hanson, Vice President of Studies, sitting in for our regular World Review host, Ivo Daalder. And joining me for this week's discussion are Karen DeYoung, who is Associate Editor and Senior National Security Correspondent at the Washington Post. Welcome, Karen. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And returning to the show is Carol Giacomo, who is the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton, as well as a member of the editorial board of the New York Times. Good to have you back, Carol.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
And rounding out our panel is Stefan Kornelius, who is the foreign editor of the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung. Thanks for being here, Stefan.
Pleasure.
So as we get going, I want to note that the Council is a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan platform, and the views expressed by the individuals that we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. For those of you tuning in, I want you to know that you can join the discussion. You can propose a question or vote on a question that others have suggested. To do so, please turn to your web browser and go to ccga.live, and I'll keep my eye on the feed of incoming questions. Finally, a recording of this program will be on our website and social media channels soon after we're done, and I encourage you to share it with your networks. Now to this week's news and stories. And one of the big stories this week has been the growing international concern about, even maybe backlash, against China over the coronavirus. Throughout this crisis, of course, there have been flare-ups and tensions with China, often with the U.S. But it seemed that this week that we reached a new level in the level of concern, as well as a spread of the countries who have expressed concerns about China's behavior. Not only the U.S., but Australia, Japan, India, European countries, all accusing China of heavy-handedness at this time. Carol, I want to start with you. What's going on here? What is driving this growing backlash against China? And is there indeed a new heavy-handedness that we're seeing?
Well, I think you can start with the United States. Everybody wants to know where the coronavirus came from. And President Trump has been in the forefront. Well, personally, he's trying to deflect blame from himself for the crisis, but he has charged often that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan, the Chinese city where the pandemic first erupted. On Sunday, Secretary of State Pompeo, who's also the former head of the CIA, backed up Mr. Trump quite effusively and said on television there's enormous evidence that the coronavirus came from the lab. But the intelligence community has yet to reach a definitive conclusion. And on Monday, in an interview with National Geographic, Tony Fauci, who's the director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, arguably the most credible face of the U.S. response to the coronavirus, said the best evidence shows that the virus was not made in a lab in China. And he said that basically it evolved in nature and then jumped the species, meaning going from animal to human. At any rate, Pompeo has subsequently modified his comments. He's went from saying that he had substantial evidence to saying, well, that there's evidence it came from somewhere in the vicinity of the lab, but that could be wrong. So he's kind of backed down. But all of this kind of rhetoric blaming China and Trump has tried to brand this virus as the Wuhan virus so that it really, lays at the feet of Beijing. National security analysts are very concerned because this is just exacerbating the tensions with China, and it's a country which we have big problems with, but also we need to solve all of the major problems in the world, including a pandemic like this. So as you said, the international community has also become more concerned. I mean, China was very covert, very secretive about what was going on with the virus to begin with. And people are rightly, I think, angry that that China was not more forthcoming in a way that the rest of us could have responded in a much better fashion. So you've got the Australians calling for an inquiry into, the origins of the virus. Germany and Britain are now hesitating about whether or not they're going to invite Huawei into their countries. Some governments want to punish Beijing. I mean, Trump has also talked about some sort of punitive action against China. So the situation is only getting worse, and what we really need to do is be honest about, try to find honest answers, and then work with China to find solutions to this virus.
So, Stefan, I want to bring you into this because one of the things that's been interesting to me has been the intensification of tensions with China in Europe. Traditionally, Europe has been dancing this kind of middle ground between the U.S. and China, and trying not to be in a position of choosing sides. Countries like Germany, of course, big export a tremendous amount to China. It's an important set of interest. Yet, as Carol just mentioned, in a number of countries, those that she mentioned, as well as the Netherlands and others, there have been strong pushbacks against China. What's driving this, and why is Europe engaging like this, and how far is this likely to go?
It's a pretty mixed picture right now. You do have countries who openly embrace China. There are polls out from Italy which actually point to the fact that the majority of Italians see China as their prime ally now, much sort of ahead of Germany and others. You do have countries like Serbia, which openly subverted themselves to China. Poland had to make sort of a kowtow just to get a couple of mosques into the country. You have the backlash on the other sides with open aggression and hostility towards China. And I think what's happening right now is kind of a search committee being out there trying to establish a policy, and a couple of dates are out there to watch. First, the Chinese-German governmental consultations, which are supposed to take place in June, most likely will take place virtually or via video. But those negotiations are always accompanied with a lot of talk in advance. So a lot of things have to be settled right now. And the questions to be asked and to be demanded of China is, when do you open up for inspection? When do you open up for a joint investigation together with WHO? And how do you explain this kind of aggressiveness and coerciveness you're showing in your reaction to our reaction of yours? So there's a lot of tension out there. But just to give the flip side of what Carol said on the American reading, the way the Trump administration is overplaying this whole thing is alienating in the same terms. So this distracts from the key problem. And the reading basically is pretty much both sides, China and the US, are scapegoating right now. The US is building up a narrative which will perfectly lead us into the election. And China, and that's what I read and that's what I hear from the experts, is under severe pressure domestically. I mean, the economic downturn will really hit the country hard. Xi's reign is unchallenged, but nevertheless, the whole construct is now on shaking legs. And so Germany's or Europe is bound in the middle of this. And the key point we're approaching will be the EU-China summit in September, where the European Union will have to come to common understanding on how to approach this, what to demand from China in a justified way, and where to block off American demands. And definitely sort of distance themselves from a narrative about the Wuhan laboratory, for example, which is now, I think one can say that, scientifically nonsense.
Yeah. So, Karen, Stefan just laid out the domestic drivers of this kind of back and forth between the U.S. and China right now. And there's also reporting that President Trump has been on the phone talking to allies, trying to gin up support and reinforcement of these anti-Chinese messages. I want to put this in the context of broader foreign policy and solving global problems. Obviously, China and the U.S. are really important countries, and we are in the midst of a global health crisis and related global financial crisis. Given the fact that this is being driven by domestic politics on both sides, to what extent do we think that this is going to get in the way of or create problems for any kind of cooperation on issues that we have mutual interests on?
Well, I agree what Stefan said about it becoming an issue of domestic politics. I don't think anybody in the world thinks China has behaved well throughout this situation. The question is, did they behave intentionally badly? Is it just a product of an autocratic, authoritarian system that is incapable of being honest and open about these things and bringing other people in? But I think in Europe and many other places, the feeling is that, fine, we all agree China didn't necessarily do the right thing, but let's wait, and we're dealing with the current situation now, and so let's wait and try to figure out after we deal with what's right in front of our faces, who shares the blame and how do we keep this from happening again. I think that within the Trump administration there are factions that want to keep it separate, want to keep both the pandemic response and the attempt to blame China separate from these trade negotiations. They want phase one to continue. They want to go to phase two. I think that as this escalates, however, we're going to see that that's going to become a lot more difficult. If you look back to how this all got started in the United States, and the whole sort of blame China thing, at the same time that the president was saying President Xi is a great guy, China's trying really hard, they're being transparent. You had in the conservative media, you had Senator Tom Cotton all saying, wait a minute, we believe that this is a man-made virus, that it is part of China's foreign policy, and they did this to unleash it against the world. About the middle of last month, you had President Trump all of a sudden saying, yeah, it's China's fault. And I think that shows the politics of this. A lot of pressure on the intelligence community, so far resisted pretty much to say, yep, we agree. Came out of this lab, even though the scientists, as Carol said, have said repeatedly, no, we actually think it didn't come out of the lab. We think it came out of the market there. It was an animal to human transmission through the market. You have the president again now blaming it on Joe Biden, saying this is a reason not to elect him president because he's soft on China. You have Republican Party instructions going out to candidates to say, blame it on China and describe Biden as soft on China. So I think that it's kind of moving directly or has already arrived in the middle of domestic politics, as everything in this country seems to do lately. Even as the people on the economic side are saying, whoa, you want to build up the economy really quickly once that moment has arrived, and you need to think through what we're doing with China. Yes, eventually we don't want to have our supply chains run through China quite as much as they have. But at the same time, we're not going to eliminate that. We can say we're against globalization, but we are not going to eliminate the global marketplace, because that really would be cutting off our own nose to spite our face.
So one of the aspects, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the tension, the internal tension is seen in, we'll just take one little anecdote, where Trump on Sunday was threatening to terminate the trade deal with China, if it didn't meet its obligations to purchase what it had promised to purchase, even though its economy is in free fall like most others. Today, apparently, there was a call between U.S. and China economic leaders, and they were conciliatory about trying to have China fulfill this deal and move it forward. So, so to Karen's point, there's this tension internally as well.
So I want to pick up on one of the threads that we've touched on in this conversation and explore it a little further, which is the Trump versus the intelligence community when it comes to where the virus came from. Did it come from a lab? Was it intentional? This set of issues. And the piece that I want to explore a little bit is, for some of the observers, this reminds people of the 2003 run-up to the Iraq War, when there were tensions between political leaders and the intelligence community, and a concern that there will be pressure on the intelligence community in order to provide the kinds of answers that the political leaders want. In this case, to support this narrative of China being blamed. Karen, I want to come back to you and build on what you were just saying. To what extent, it seems like the intelligence community has pretty clearly said that we don't think this has come. Certainly it wasn't developed in a lab, and there's no evidence that they've seen that it's escaped from a lab. Should we be concerned about this rift between the administration and the intelligence community?
Well, I think that what they've said so far is that it could have escaped from the lab. Mm-hmm. They've said we're pretty sure it was not man-made, and it was not an intentional escape from the lab, that it could have been accidental, or it could have been something at the market where an animal that was infected was ingested by a human. The scientists have said they don't believe that. The intelligence community has not come down one way or the other now. And I think you have to realize that President Trump has moved pretty aggressively to put his own people in the intelligence community, getting rid of the Inspector General, putting in Ambassador Grinnell as the interim director, who's been very, very vocal and very strongly supportive of President Trump, and now Congressman Radcliffe, who's just had his confirmation hearings this week and will probably be approved. Now, I do think, though, that there's a lot of pushback inside the intelligence community, and that this is not like Iraq, I think, where there was a national security question. And some people really believed it. I mean, they really believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so they picked and chose among pieces of intelligence to sort of construct a narrative that where the individual pieces weren't false, but if you put it in the larger negative, you could see that, in fact, it didn't really hang together. This is looking increasingly political. And I think that's where you'll get pushback. And remember, a lot of these intelligence people lived through, to their shame, a lot of them, what happened with Iraq. So, and you've got a lot of Congress people saying, look, as they have said throughout this pandemic, listen to the science, listen to the science. And the science people have been pretty strong, saying there is a scientific way to determine where this came from. Mm-hmm. And from what we've been able to find out there, it did not come from this lab. The intelligence community in the United States is still kind of hanging out there saying it could have, but they haven't given a definitive answer yet, even though Pompeo has said there's enormous evidence that it came from the lab. And despite repeated questions when he appeared for a briefing with the press this week saying, well, what evidence? He hasn't presented any.
So, Carol, I do want to put this in the broader context. This isn't the first time, obviously, that there's been tension between the administration and the intelligence community. Over time, is this having a negative effect on the ability of the intelligence community to do its job and ultimately protect U.S. national security? Is there a broader trend here that we should be concerned about?
Well, I think from the very beginning, Trump was hostile and suspicious of the intelligence community, and that this has just laid a basis for tensions between the professionals and the executive branch throughout his administration. So yeah, I think it's a real problem. And as Karen said, Trump has now moved pretty aggressively to put loyalists, not just his own people, but real loyalists into every place he can possibly put them, the most critical, most sensitive jobs. And so one can only assume that he's going to have greater control and that there'll be less. I mean, the professionals, this government, even though politicians over time abuse them, there is a cadre of professionals in the U.S. government, which we should be grateful that we have because they do their job and they are committed to the greater good. We'll see if how this affects the long-term prognosis for people who are committed to doing this job professionally.
And Stefan, I'm interested in the perspective from our allies. Of course, one of the areas of great cooperation for the benefit of all of our security is the cooperation between our intelligence services. Particularly the war on terrorism had a very intense set of cooperation. We've got, the actions of Russia and other countries that continue to be ongoing concerns to both the U.S. and Germany and European allies. Does what's going on here call into question or in any way kind of put the relationships, the trust and the reliability of that intelligence cooperation into question?
Not as long as the president wouldn't turn it into something like that. I think the community itself is very in line in saying the whole laboratory issue is not of our concern. As I said, evidence points so strongly against it that this is not what you need to build a case against China. If you want to build a case against China, and certainly you can, you have to point to the negligence and the political failures which have been made after the virus broke out roughly around December 20th, where about for 2-3 weeks, for political reason, the whole thing was toned down, was shielded away from public, was not really pushed up to the level it should have been pushed up. There was a party political meeting going on in Wuhan. So there's a lot of neglect from the Chinese side, but it's all political and it's out there, it's blank open. So if you want to build a case, you should use these arguments and not sort of work on a conspiracy thing where you sort of have secret laboratories breeding some germs. That's not a fact. There are actually American papers out there pointing to the virus having at least 3 to 4 streaks and going back, even dating back, finding documentation even as early as October or September. Just yesterday in France, there was the patient number 0 discovered or made public, a man who got infected around early December, and he wasn't traveling anywhere near this place. So I guess it doesn't help us. The whole thing is far more political, and it's about this huge major conflict we see between the US and China. And yes, in that conflict, the intelligence community definitely has a huge interest in joining forces, because there are much other things going on in terms of manipulation of information, in terms of covert action now taking place, even in the industrial side. We will see sort of a relocation, a repatriation of industries on a large scale, because we all saw how open, how vulnerable we are for not having mouthpieces and technical stuff and whatever. So yes, the Chinese will be hit hard, but for obvious reasons, because we were not politically sort of critical or enough to question on how we engage with them without having political precautionary measures from preventing them to take over our operations.
And I think to that point, there was also information this week indicating that, as Stefan said, there are different strains of the virus, that the belief is now that virtually every case in the eastern part of the United States came from Europe and not from China. And most of the cases on the West Coast also came from Europe and not from China. I mean, they may have gone to China, from China in the first place to Europe, and then come here. But this would have been, as Stefan said, in the late fall, long before anybody was saying, "My God, we need to close down. We need to, take this more seriously." I mean, you can also blame China for that, but I agree that it's certainly both in the United States and in China, it's a political issue.
Mm-hmm. And if we find the virus, just a small point. So if we find the origin of the virus, what does it mean? Are we holding China responsible for it financially? What's going to happen then? And this is, the bigger question behind it. And we saw the legislation being introduced by the senator from Missouri, which I found just flabbergasting. I mean, this is amazing that you can turn it into a court case. I think the U.S. is losing a lot of credibility acting that way. That's a big shame, and in times where we need to build alliances, and where we will see this kind of polarization with China, and I'm damn sure we haven't seen the thick of it yet. The administration would be so well advised to rally us behind them, behind their reading, behind their narrative, but that you can't do it on that base.
This is World Review, and I'm joined today by Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post, Carol Giacomo of the New York Times, and Stefan Kornelius of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, I want to stay with you and talk about a leader who is seemingly much more successful in managing this situation and the disease, which is Angela Merkel. And you literally wrote the book on Angela Merkel as the author of a major biography about her. She went into this crisis in a relatively weak position, having struggled in recent elections, having announced that she wouldn't stand again in 2021. But she has been seen as incredibly successful in leading the country through this disease, as approval ratings over 80%. Why has she been so successful? What's the secret sauce for her?
Well, the secret is she hasn't changed. And it's as simple as that. I mean, she really had a bad run for 3 years. The fourth term was a bad one, setting off from the very first day on the wrong foot. And then the crisis came, and the crisis in all of our countries turned into a moment of the executive. And her ability to lead the executive and to sort of work methodologically, sort of scientifically on that issue, together with an administration and sort of a bureaucracy which actually is functioning, really made the day. The combination of early reaction, of a functioning bureaucracy, of an extremely well-built healthcare system, and a pretty remote and sober and sort of unideological leader in that point helped Germany tremendously. And this is why this country got off so well in this crisis. In the end, her characteristics of being a moderate person, of not being self-imposing on this, really contributed to the credibility she needed.
And I want to ask you also about any shifts in politics. One of the things that was true in Europe and in many democracies, including our own, going into this crisis was concern about the rise of populism and falling support for parties of the center right and center left in Germany, increasing support for more extreme parties on the right and left. Has this experience caused a change in political support? Is this going to reshape politics in Germany, do you think?
Well, not only in Germany, all over Europe, you do see that populists really have not been able to benefit from the situation. They are actually exposed as the ones who, well, simply big mouths, but not the ones who took action and decisive action. Neither in Hungary nor Poland nor in Britain. Britain is really worst off, and Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, is extremely sobered now, also after his own life-threatening experience. Yes, populism seems to be on the decline, and that's good news. Probably governments are now measured on what they can deliver and not how they basically sell it.
And Karen, how do you see this issue as you look around the world for whether or not this is blunting populism? I guess I reflect on the U.S. and one of the things that I wonder is that if we've actually intensified the polarization in this country, for example. What do you see as the dynamics that have been set loose here?
Well, I think the best place to look at it, say Latin America, and look at President Bolsonaro, who was elected for many of the same reasons that President Trump was elected. He's a kind of out front guy, says politically incorrect things, is very close to Trump, very far on the right. He dismissed the pandemic very early on as akin to having the sniffles or a cold, did not impose any kind of restrictions on anybody. And as with many places, it was left to city governments, state governments to do it. You've had a really quickly rising number of cases there and deaths, and they clearly have not gotten anywhere near the peak yet. Bolsonaro has fired a lot of people in his government who sort of disagreed with how he was handling this or his interpretation with it. And to take their place, he's imported a lot of senior people from the military, which is a pretty ominous thing for Brazil, which, like many countries in Latin America, had a military government until the early to mid 80s. And I think there are some people in Brazil who feel that things have gotten so out of hand there for the same reasons that they did in the kind of anti-communist era that brought the military to power in the first place. Now they say, oh, perhaps only the military can get this situation back on the right track. I mean, Bolsonaro has like Trump has criticized the courts, saying that they are against him. He's attempted with some success to put his own people in the courts. So I think that that's the place where you see the most difficulty. And you see what can happen, just as it's happened here, where you have politics becoming the sort of main driver of response to the virus.
And I want to turn back to Brazil in a moment. Before we go there, Carol, I want to bring you in. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is there's been a meme around social media about the most successful countries in fighting this virus, so many of them led by women, whether it's Germany that we were just talking about, Denmark, Taiwan, and others. I think the other thing that strikes me along the lines of what Karen was just talking about, and what Stefan was talking about, if you think about the populist leaders, whether it is Bolsonaro, whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's our own version, Trump here in the United States, Boris Johnson in the UK, they tend to be men. Is the response, the difference in response and difference in effectiveness, about gender, about populism, or is there some sort of correlation between these things?
I don't really know. I mean, I think that we don't have enough women in power in important or in countries around the world to I think, to do metrics on this. But it is significant when you do look at Merkel, who's a scientist and who has also proven, she proved her leadership ability in shepherding Germany through previous crises. And now in New Zealand, and as you said, in Taiwan as well, both of those countries have done pretty well in getting through the coronavirus. And I would argue the New Zealand leader has also shown her mettle and her humanity in shepherding her country through that terrible terrorist attack as well. I mean, I don't know if you can make, I mean, none of them are populism, you know. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, really.
Well, we'll find out as things unfold. Let me, and we'll also watch to what happens with Germany. Of course, there was a big announcement this week about reopening the economy in many ways, shops, schools, even bars and restaurants. And Stefan, everybody is interested in how to do this and what lessons can be learned as others experiment with this. This seems to be a fairly bold step in Germany, as well as it seems that we're starting to hear some differences between different lenders, the federal states that have a great deal of power here. What do you expect to unfold in Germany as this opening continues? Will it continue to be fairly coordinated as it has been so far, or is it going to become more political and potentially spark another rise in this virus?
Well, I guess probably part of the German success is that Germans live up to all the prejudices you have about them, to be very disciplined and so on. I mean, in a more sober note, I think the key now is that this country has a federal structure, meaning not everything is centralized as in the United States. Local levels can decide autonomously. The bureaucracy goes down in a very wide net spread network where there is sort of responsibility down there and autonomy in decision making. So the idea now is to hand down responsibility to the lender or to the states, the federal states, and even lower to the districts, where you can micro-target outbreaks of the COVID-19 symptoms, quarantine them again, beef up restrictions again, and turn them back down to normal. So this is what's going to happen. The other key word is distancing. This will remain in place. People need to sort of keep some healthy distance, so you won't see a quick reopening of shops and of definitely not theaters, and soccer games will be without spectators. So it will be a different life, but there will be a life. And actually France is choosing the same path right now. So I do see this happening all over Europe. Austria is doing it. Even Northern Italy today announced to open up again. So normalcy will come back, but the key thing is to watch it. And if it's not being watched and contained, if it reemerges, then you'll have the second wave.
Well, we will all be watching that very carefully. And Karen, I want to turn back to the discussion that you started about Bolsonaro, which is a really interesting and important case. And as you talked about his cavalier attitude toward the virus. In addition, he's had further controversies when he fired his police chief. The economy is in free fall. They're actually increasing calls for his impeachment. My question is how serious is this for him, and is he going to survive?
I think that's a good question. Brazil, again, like a number of countries in Latin America, has a history of unsuccessful civilian governments not surviving. And again, as I said, the military is increasingly involved. They've been in the government before. The opposition is in disarray. There is no strong, organized opposition force there. So the question is, as more and more people become dissatisfied, assuming that the pandemic gets worse, that the economy gets worse, how are people going to react? And I don't know that we know the answer to that yet. There are, again, military people who are already in the government. I think they occupy more than half of the cabinet seats now in Bolsonaro's government. So he himself has turned to them, whether to build public confidence or to adopt measures that make people more apt to follow instructions. So I don't know yet. I think the economy is doing really, really poorly, and they're not going to have the cushion to bounce back up on that some other countries may have. And so pressure against him will certainly build, and he's very unpopular now. And I don't think we know yet what direction that's going to go in.
Karen, can I ask a question? Bolsonaro's assault on the rainforest and indigenous people just seems to be, he promised he would do that in his election, and he certainly seems to be doing it with a vengeance. And I wondered whether have you seen any real negative fallout for him because of that?
Well, I think that issue is sort of like the whole sort of national park oil lease issue in this country. There are many people who say, oh no, we can't let that happen. This is our national patrimony, in addition to what it contributes to world climate. There are other people who say, basically, we need the money. And why are we wasting all of this land when business could be in there looking for oil, getting lumber, and why are we so protective of the indigenous people? So again, I have not seen anything that shows which way that's tilting at the moment, but there definitely are those two forces, the same as there are in this country.
Karen, what's your guess? Are we seeing a resolution first in Brazil or in the United States?
A resolution in what way?
Revolution.
Revolution. Well, a revolution. I think we have to wait and see what happens with the election here. That will be a pretty sharp divide between those two forces that I outlined. Although, that's only on one issue. But I think that will Bolsonaro's government somehow collapse before November? I don't know.
But the numbers of people, COVID cases is rising in Brazil.
Yeah.
And, if he persists in this policy of, everybody go ahead and go out there and just keep going on with your lives and having meetings and going to restaurants, that could be politically damaging to him as well as lethal to the people of Brazil. So,
well, as I said, a lot of cities, Rio has a lockdown on the beach. You can't go out to Ipanema and be on the beach. So again, it's very similar to what's been happening here, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that struck me about this conversation is how many really important issues are in play and that we're watching develop in real time in these unprecedented times. So
We
Karen
didn't even
DeYoung,
talk about crazy Venezuela.
yes, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about that. That was the next thing I was going to go to, but unfortunately we're out of time.
Throw in Albania.
Yeah, so much to talk about. I have an idea. Let's do this show again next week. But for now, let me thank Karen DeYoung, Carol Giacomo, and Stefan Kornelius for being on World Review this week. For all of you who tuned in, I hope you'll join us again next week, 10 o'clock Chicago time, when Ivo Daalder will return to the host chair. And just a quick reminder that there'll be a recording of this program on our website. We encourage you to share it with your networks. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.